Tell me a fact and I'll learn. Tell me a truth and I'll believe. But tell me a story and it will live in my heart forever. The Names Not Numbers Oral History Film Documentary Project is remembering the stories of the Holocaust and is telling the story of the Holocaust for the world to hear, for the world to learn, and to inspire future generations to combat anti-Semitism and all forms of hatred and intolerance. This unique project is in its 16th year. Over 2,500 survivors and 6,000 students have participated in it worldwide. The students were instructed by teachers and professionals. They learned interviewing techniques from journalists. They learned filming techniques and editing skills from documentary filmmakers. The students interviewed, filmed, and edited the 2-hour interviews with each survivor to make 20-minute oral histories that are compiled in the Names Not Numbers documentary at the school. You're about to view the documentary Names Not Numbers, a movie in the making. This film chronicles the students as they are being trained by the professionals and includes their reflections. In it is embedded approximately 10 minutes from each interview. This is the students' work. They're filmed and edited interviews. Through this project, our students are preserving history, and they are the witnesses to the witnesses.
Everybody was totally frightened because we'd had such bad experience in Germany.
Bombs fell nearly every night, but you were fully aware that your life was in danger at every moment.
We have to do this again because we need to spread the word. We need to make sure that everybody knows the truth. This is something that's very, very important, and we can't just let it slip through our hands. We gotta jump up and grab the chance now.
Welcome to the Names Not Numbers program. I know a lot of you are excited. It's a very special opportunity. And you guys are the last generation. And this is a privilege, a zechut, but it's a responsibility. Names Not Numbers is a program that'll change your life. So take that moment to think about it. And Baruch Hashem, you'll have a video, you'll learn, you'll have it as a record, a document, but also take those moments to look at those relationships and learn from the people in front of you, because you guys will be those shlichim, the representatives, to be able to teach the next generation. But this way, something like the Holocaust should and never happen again. You're going to learn a lot this year. You're going to meet a lot of people this year. You're going to laugh. You're going to cry. You're going to smile. You're going to learn. But something that you can guarantee is that you'll remember this the rest of your lives.
Today, 77 years after the end of the Holocaust, among young Americans, 66% of them could not identify that Auschwitz was a concentration death camp. One of the most famous people who wrote about what was going on, and that was President Eisenhower. During the war, was a general in the American Army. And he took a trip to a concentration camp in April 1945. He said, "I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things, if ever In the future, there develops a tendency to charge these allegations as being propaganda. General Eisenhower is already predicting that in the future, people are going to say, this never happened. But we have documentation. We have unique historical documents that preserve certain facets of the Holocaust in real time. We still have survivors who are in Auschwitz, who have the number tattooed on their arm. You are the last generation that has the privilege to hear the survivors' testimonies firsthand, because you are going to be telling their stories. And you are doing this by making your movie. You will be asking the questions. You students are learning history, you're recording history, and you're preserving history through your work. 100 years from now, it'll be your interviews, your filmed interviews, that will be used to prove that this really happened to the Jewish people.
They took us to the train station where there were boxcars, and they pushed in 100 people into each boxcar.
Today we watched a film about Moshe Avital. It was a very meaningful video. I think that it put a lot of pressure on me and my peers.
I couldn't believe a student actually did that.
It was edited really well, which means that we had to do a lot of work with filming.
I felt that it was super cool how students could make such a cool movie.
Editing the video with software, and that was a lot of pressure to make a video that would educate the next generation.
And they asked around in the wagon, anybody ever heard the name Auschwitz?
Today we started the process of Names Not Numbers and learning how to ask questions.
What does every story have? 3 elements in every single story ever told. You're going to have to start with the beginning, you're going to have to find out what the middle is, and you're going to have to find out what the end is.
Something that I'm scared of is asking questions.
What happened to you during the war? What kind of family did you grow up in? Where was that family? Did your family keep Shabbos?
Just be asking questions that aren't yes or no answers, because you won't be hearing us ask the questions, you're just going to be hearing them say the story.
How do you know which questions to ask? You have to do your research. Once you prepare yourself for your survivor, you'll be able to start asking questions and let them pause and let them think so that they can give you a good answer. If you're going to ask questions that'll give you yes or no answers, you're not going to have a film.
You want to add on to your question so that she'll be able to give a longer, or he will be able to give a longer answer.
This topic is really sensitive to the Holocaust survivors, so they might start crying and you need to give them tissues or give them breaks sometimes.
One of the things we say is have a glass of water ready next to your survivor, have a box of tissues handy next to your survivor, because you don't know what's going to happen. And when it comes to paying attention, you need to pay attention, and you may miss something. When you're done with this project, you will be able to interview anybody about anything.
The tips I got from the journalists were very useful, yes.
At the museum, they showed us different exhibits, and they told us about a few people's stories, and we were looking around the museum a little bit.
And they showed us clothing that people in the Holocaust wore.
And we saw some artifacts from a survivor.
People made some crosses to pretend they're Christian.
She had the Christian prayer beads, and she learned how to use them properly so the Nazis would think that she's Christian and they wouldn't kill her.
And there was a dress of a girl from before the war, and there was a picture of a girl in her dress, and then they pulled out the dress and it was whoa. I learned about camera and how to work them and how to zoom in, how to zoom out, how to really focus on the survivor and what they're saying.
My name is Adam, and I'll be the filmmaker with you guys this coming week. And I'm going to be teaching you how to use the cameras.
Well, I've never really learned how to use a camera before, but now I am, and it's really cool because I've never done that before.
I learned how to use cameras, and I've never had that experience before.
Filming with a cell phone and filming with one of these big cameras are extremely, extremely similar. If I was to film with a cell phone, what do I do?
On a cell phone, you can zoom in with your fingers, and here it's just a button, and they really do the same things, just like with different hand stuff that you can do.
The main difference is that you have more control with this type of camera compared to a cell phone.
You just use it manually instead of touching the screen.
Cell phone, everything is on auto. This is not. Everything is on manual.
I learned that there are 2 channels of volume.
Channel 1 is going to be the survivor, and channel 2, when you're listening, is going to be the student.
There are 2 volume dials, and whichever person you're testing, you turn that dial.
And the levels are kind of staying between these 2. We don't want it to get it to the red, because this is good sound. Red is this is good sound.
And you say, can you do a sound check, and they count to 10.
And then you listen and you could turn the dials.
You could just hear literally everything. I enjoyed using the film equipment and using real professional equipment. It was a great learning experience.
Filming was a lot of fun.
I'm very excited to interview and ask any question. My great-grandmother was a survivor, and I was never able to ask her questions about it because I was young. It's a very sensitive topic, and I'm very interested.
It's very real when you meet someone who's been through something, and I am excited to interview him, but I'm also a little nervous that I'll say the wrong thing.
I get to meet someone who went through such a hard time period, so I'm basically meeting a piece of history.
This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity because I know later on there isn't going to be as many survivors, so I felt that was very important.
I'm scared to meet a survivor because they've been through so much.
It feels special that I get the opportunity to do it, but I'm scared because I'm scared I might mess up. I've never met a survivor, and I feel so honored to be able to meet and interview and learn about their experience.
This is the first time I'm hearing a story firsthand from a survivor.
Today I'm going to meet a survivor for the first time, and I feel nervous, but I'm also excited about it because it's my first time.
I feel there's a lot of pressure because I don't know how she's going to react to some of my questions, and I don't know how I'm going to react to some of her answers.
I'm feeling excited because I really want to hear all about their past. And I think it's going to be very inspirational.
I'm just so excited to meet a survivor in person.
Today I'm going to be interviewing my great uncle, Michael Epstein. And this is the first time I'm going to be hearing his story, so I'm really excited.
I will be interviewing Mrs. Eva Wiener. I'm nervous because I don't really know how I'm going to react to what she's saying.
We are the last generation who's going to be meeting these Holocaust survivors. It's very important to meet them firsthand and hear their stories.
So you could feel the story in person, so you could ask them your own questions.
How do they survive after the Holocaust?
How they go on living today with full trust that they're going to keep on living with the trust that they have in Hashem.
How do they cope today with what happened to them in the past?
How did the Holocaust affect your belief in Hashem?
What keeps you going?
How did you feel when your first child was born?
Names on numbers, RPRY, Dr. Erwin Tepper. Take 1.
My name is Erwin Tepper. I was born in Vienna in November 14th, 1931. I'm an only child. My father, he got a job working in a store that sold ladies' underwear. We stayed in an apartment house. We lived on the 3rd floor, which was very nice because directly underneath me, 2nd floor, was my best friend, not Jewish, my age, and we went to school together, we played together, and he was essentially my friend, and we had no phones, so we connected with broomsticks, ding, 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 and ding, ding, ding. They loved operas, so they would go to an opera, and I'd get a very nice babysitter. We actually never went to the Prater. You know, in Vienna they had that big Ferris wheel. We went to this park, which was across the street. So my friend and I, we were allowed to go to the park alone. One day after Nazi occupation of Vienna, no Jews were allowed in parks. And a park policeman, I guess, or some policeman came. He knew I was Jewish and he started dragging me off. And I put up one big fuss, kicking and screaming and hollering. The guy was going to throw me in jail and throw away the key. But somehow they got a hold of my mother. She came, and the clerk, the head of the police department there, just told my mother, take the little brat and just get out of here and make sure it doesn't happen again. My mother ran a kosher house. We did not have any prayers really at home. Well, Passover was a big deal. My mother did all the cooking, and very good. She was a good cook. Most of the time, it was at home with relatives, invited relatives. Before the war, I went to a school. As I recall, it was only boys, but I went up to 2nd grade.
My name is Eva Safir Wiener. I was born in Berlin, Germany, 1938. I have no siblings. I'm an only child. Berlin was a very culturally advanced city, lots of theaters and lots of universities, and life in Germany for the Jewish population up until approximately 1933 was wonderful. My father's family established one of the first kosher and largest kosher Jewish bakeries in Berlin, and he was one of 8 siblings. So all of the children worked in the bakery, and it was a very, very successful business. My mother was one of 4. She had a brother and 2 sisters, and she was trained as a dressmaker in a very, very fashionable couturier-type dress shop. My mother and father were both Polish immigrants to the city of Berlin. My family was Orthodox, observed Shabbat. My father was very active in the synagogue that they attended. Life in Germany was wonderful until Hitler and his Nazi regime came to power.
My name is Michael Epstein. I was born in 1935 in Lodz, Poland. We lived in an apartment building. My father was a butcher and my mother was a seamstress. We lived on a street which was predominantly Jewish, so it was very rich Jewish life. Anti-Semitism, there was lots of it. Jewish people couldn't go to certain colleges. They couldn't work in certain professions.
My name is Mona Ginsberg. I was born in Austria, Vienna, on December 1st, 1933. Austria was a better place, especially Vienna, for Jews than Poland, even Krakow. I remember my parents had a store, vegetables, fruit, and dairy. We had a sukkah in front of the house. It was a community sukkah. The men on the street. My mother brought in food, and me being a child, I went in with my father. And I also remember my mother at night would tell me stories, and then a short prayer. And I was 5 years old when we fled from Vienna. And we knew that times were very, very bad for the Jewish people in Vienna. After the brick was thrown into our home, I even remember the brick was thrown on a bed and the glass shattered on the bed. And the look of horror on everybody's face.
My name is Manfred Lindenbaum.
When were you born?
1932 in October. In the Ruhr Valley in Germany, the town is called Unna. It was a very welcoming place. Even had a small Jewish community. The people were very friendly. That's my very earliest memories. My father was looking for a place to start a business where he could make a living, and he found a small store in Unna with a little apartment above it. My father had a men's clothing store, but my mother helped in the store and took care of the house. My brother went to school. When it was time for me to go to school, my brother at that point was coming home having been beaten up every day, every single day. He insisted on going back to school the next day. I was not permitted to start school because it was too dangerous. My sister continued going to school. She did lose her friends, but everybody showed her respect as far as my memory goes. At one point I snuck out of the house, which I wasn't allowed to do anymore, because there was a whole bunch of people going together, and it turned out to be a Nazi rally. And when I got back, my mother was so scared. I remember her taking the carpet beater and hitting me because she was scared that something would happen to me. Our friends who were not Jewish, they didn't turn against us, they just disappeared. They didn't come around anymore. In my opinion, that's the reason things got so bad, because good people kept very quiet and didn't say anything. We were actually chased out of Unna 2 weeks before Kristallnacht.
I do remember Kristallnacht in the evening. The brown shirts came looking for adult male people. They came into our apartment and looked around. My father was not home. My mother was worried, went to bed. Next day, my father never came home that next day. We had no phone, so what can we do? Sit and wait.
When Kristallnacht happened, everything stopped. It was a night that was worse than any riots that anyone can imagine. The military and the police were marching through the streets, smashing the windows of all the businesses that belonged to the Jewish people of Berlin.
My father didn't come home that next night also, but he did come home that next day in the afternoon. When the Nazis came in that store, you had to become Aryanized, so he was discharged. It turned out the owner of that store, Mr. Bienstock, he was German, not Jewish, but he hated the Nazis as much as everybody else. And he and the people that worked in that store took my father in and hid him in a back storeroom. And he stayed there for 2 days and 2 nights.
Describe what life was like for you after your father left.
He was taken out of the apartment, placed on a train, and sent to Warsaw, Poland. They were sending people who had not been born in Germany back to what they called country of origin, and he was on a train with hundreds of other men. He found himself in Warsaw in a 1-bedroom apartment, sharing it with 12 other men. But that wasn't his concern. His concern was that he had left a wife and a baby back in Berlin and didn't know what our fate was going to be. And that worried him more than living in such tight quarters.
The next day after Kristallnacht, what did the town look like?
Well, it looked like it got bombed. You know, we went to so-called school and you could see damage in the town.
They smashed and burned the synagogue, and they took all the holy books and the Sfarim and the Torah and took them out on the street and burned them.
And that was Kristallnacht that I do remember.
My father had relatives in Belgium, and we fled on foot in the snow. And I remember following my father carrying my 18-month-old brother in a knapsack. Children were not allowed to cross the border, so then we were put on a train. When the war broke out in Belgium, we had to leave Antwerp and we went to a different town. My father had relatives there too. The town was called Liège, and I remember Liège very fondly. My parents found out that Catholic clergy were hiding children. They put us into these homes. And from there we were put into private families, because the Nazis even came to the homes, the children's homes, to look for Jewish children. After a time we had to wear yellow badges with the Star of David, even children. It was a little bit embarrassing. I didn't like to be different from other children. I mean, after a while you forget, you just get caught up in what you do, They had said if the women would go to work in the factories for the Nazis, they wouldn't bother the men. So my mother went to work. Well, that was already after we had been put in hiding, though. And after a few days she came home, and the neighbors told her that my father had been arrested. And there had been what they called roundups in the town. They put all those people on a train. First a stopover in Belgium, in a town called Malines. And after that, my father was sent to Auschwitz. I mean, I know that's where he died. I was always in my own mind scared to lose my parents. But luckily, since my mother wasn't home, and she saw what happened, She took a bus to the village where my brother was, in that home, because that home had German nuns. They took her in also where my brother was. We also, during that time, we used to go on hikes. Later on, after the war, I realized it's because the Nazis were searching the homes. And that's why we had to be put out with private families. Actually, when I was put into the home, it's like you go to camp almost. I don't know, it's part of the life. It was, you accept. I was accepting, and my brother too. And he was younger. When I went into the home, I was 8.5 years old, and my brother was 5 years old.
They rounded us up. They took us through first the police station, then the train station. And when they put us on the train, they kept us there for 36 hours. They waited for Shabbat. Zeta had never traveled on Shabbat. I was 6 years old. I remember sitting with him, and as the train pulled out, everybody was very scared and uptight, and he started singing the Shabbat services. On the train, I was with my mother, my father, my brother, and my sister, and my Zeta. On the train ride, everybody was totally scared. The tension filled the air. That's why I remember so much when my Zeta started davening, that it broke the tension. My Zeta was blind. He was able to get into a Jewish home for the blind in Warsaw. My sister was able to get into an Ort village where they were going to teach her a trade. And my mother, father, and brother and me, we were not able to go anywhere. The aid organizations, HIAS, helped us there. And one of the things that they brought in was they brought in big bags. We were able to put straw in them, so you were not lying on the floor. And this made a huge difference. What was the most terrible moment of my life, and I can still feel that, my mother and father took me and my brother, my sister wasn't there at that point, to my mind, shoved us over to this stranger, and they took off and got on a train to head east. Obviously, my mother and father were heroes, that they were able in the midst of chaos to leave me with a stranger with the idea that I was going to get saved, which I was, but it probably took me 20, 30 years to get over that.
My mother was told that if she could get a visa, there was a possibility that my father would be able to come back to Germany and join her in order to leave the country. So my mother and her two sisters started standing on lines of embassies and consulates that were in Berlin, begging and pleading with any country that would issue them a visa, so that now also my father was able to make his way back to Berlin. But it was on the condition that we leave immediately. In the meantime, she had also sent money to her brother in Cuba, asking him to see if he could purchase a visa to Cuba. She also applied for immigration numbers to the United States. While my father was traveling back from Poland to Berlin, the visa for Cuba came. She was able to book passage on a ship called the SS St. Louis. When she booked passage on the ship, which was a Holland America line, she paid a very high price for the tickets, and they required you to pay round-trip fare, knowing full well that we weren't planning to come back.
My father, believe it or not, he applied for a visa to the United States and Argentina because he had a brother in Argentina. And he didn't care where we're going, where we're getting out of the Nazis. But also, he applied to HIAS. And somehow, to this day, I don't know how, they got him out. And he wound up as a refugee at a refugee camp in England. People in the United States said, we got to get at least the kids out. Well, they went through Congress, but it was not voted on because some other idiot got up and said, well, you can't take the children only and leave the parents there. That's crazy. And of course, it was just the opposite. The patients were great to get their children out of there. They weren't so much worried about themselves. They wanted the children out, as opposed to England. England said, yes, we will take your children, but not the adults. So there was what they call the Kindertransport. I think they took in 1,000 kids. An organization called Rich Shalom, they owned and ran a children's camp outside of Philadelphia every summer, and they had just completed building a brand new dormitory that would hold 50 kids. So Krauss, a very shrewd guy who was a lawyer, he said, well, why don't we rescue at least 50 kids? We'll put them in this new dormitory we got. Krauss got 50 visas. He issued them. He and his wife came to Europe to organize these things, and it was advertised. Well, about 100 people applied, if not more, and they stayed and listened, diddled, and they picked 50. Someone always asked me, why were you one of those chosen? God knows why I was chosen. I really don't know.
The airplanes came by, the German airplanes, and bombed a lot of the Jewish communities. The families had debates going on all over the place as to whether we should run away, stay where we are, and hope that the Germans will either be defeated or that they will be able to survive. The family got split up into pieces. Some stayed and some left, and we never saw each other again.
Where was your father when the war started?
He wasn't actually in the Polish army. He was fighting the Germans. They had prearranged, my mother and my father, to meet him in a town called Białystok in eastern Poland, near the Russian border. The Russians and the Germans signed a pact not to attack each other, and that they're going to divide Poland up. Some of it goes to Germany, and some of it goes to Russia. We were on the east side, so we woke up one morning finding ourselves that we were in Russia. The Russian government decided that the Polish citizens were to be sent to Siberia. They needed labor over there. The families with small children like us were allowed to stay in one of the huts. They had a stove in one of the huts with wood-fired stove. There was no bathrooms. Bathroom had to go outside. We were in forced labor camps. What that means is like you had guards around the camp. The work days started at around 5:30 in the morning. Clothing was a premium. No shoe. It was very cold, and shoes, they were non-existent. In fact, people made their own shoes from wood. Food was rationed, enough to live on. There was no medical facilities at all. People were dying rather rapidly over there. If you got sick with something, your immediate family has to help you because there was nobody else to help you.
They packed what belongings they were permitted to take. They weren't allowed to take much. Very little cash was permitted. You were only allowed to take the jewelry that you were wearing, and you only allowed one suitcase per person.
Could you sense that your mother was scared or worried?
Worried, scared, of course. They were going across the ocean, an unknown entity, going to an unknown place. The only good part of it was she had some solace in the fact that she at least had family at her destination. They were grateful to be able to get on the ship, to leave Germany because of persecution. Going there were beautiful. As any cruise ship, and this was a cruise ship that normally went to the Caribbean and traveled throughout the Caribbean islands, and we were treated as royally as any cruise ship passengers would be. There were dances and parties and movies. There was even a swimming pool on deck, and the kids were swimming in the swimming pool.
Describe what happened when your ship arrived at its destination.
We came into the harbor of Cuba and could see the dock, but they didn't allow the ship to dock. We were kept at anchor in the harbor. And all of a sudden, the passengers started to panic. They couldn't understand why we weren't allowed to dock and get off the ship. We had packed up and prepared to disembark, but things were not allowed. And all of a sudden, there was a lot of negotiation going on. The captain got on a boat and went to the dock and came back, and then some people in uniform came to the ship, and there was a lot of conferencing going on. It was very frightening, especially at first. My uncle, who was on the island of Cuba, got on a little boat with some other passengers and little tender and came out to the ship and finally spotted my parents on deck, and they shouted at each other and they tried to encourage each other. My uncle kept yelling, "Mañana, mañana," which is Spanish for tomorrow. Well, of course, that didn't happen. They had formed what was called a passenger committee, and they started contacting every country in the world, along with the Jewish Agency, which had sent a delegate to Cuba to speak to the president of Cuba, President RPRY, and try to negotiate. They even offered President RPRY money per person to let us off, but he declared the fact that he did not recognize our papers to be valid and refused to allow us off the ship. The captain turned the ship around and headed towards America. Cuba is only 90 miles away from Miami, so he felt that maybe if he could dock the ship in Miami, that the President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, would let us in. Although the passengers had telegrammed the president and asked him for safe haven, he never answered our telegrams. But the captain came so close to Miami that my father said he could almost read the license plates on the taxis on Ocean Avenue. But the minute that happened, the United States Coast Guard came out and told us to get out of American waters. There were enough supplies for the trip back. Food was not as plentiful and as luxurious on the way back as it was going. The captain tried to console the passengers by telling them that under no circumstances would he take them back to Germany, because he knew what their fate was going to be and made every effort to find someplace else to go.
They picked 50 children, 25 boys and 25 girls. My mother dropped me off at the train because my father was already in England. And we were told, do not wave goodbye, because waving goodbye could be interpreted as a Heil Hitler, and Jews were not allowed to say Heil Hitler.
The man at Spongen at the railway station said, yes, we can get kids on this boat. And that's when my parents pushed us over.
We all got on the train in Vienna and went to Berlin. That's where we got the visas, in Berlin. And the very next day, 24 hours later, after that visa, we were on a boat. And then we got on the boat and we went to Southampton to pick up passengers.
What I do remember, as we traveled across Poland to get to Danzig, the port where it was, we stopped at Otfork, where my sister was at an Ort village, and she joined us. 10 days later, we got to the port of Danzig, and that's where they wouldn't let my sister get on the boat. And when I heard that, I ran away. Between my brother and my sister, they found me and they dragged me back and they held me down because I was the real problem then. I remember getting onto the boat, me and my brother, we were on our way to England. That was the end of the Kindertransport. That was the last boat, and that was the only one of two boats that had come from Poland. The rest had all come from Europe.
This boat was a nice cruise boat. Could have movies in there and a swimming pool upstairs, and they had a swimming pool downstairs. The youngest child was 5, and the oldest child, I believe, was 14. And the older children really took care of some of the younger children. We started learning English the day we got on the boat while we were going through the English Channel. And every day on the boat, we had English lessons. That was the most important thing. We sailed across the English Channel to Southampton, picked up passengers, and then to the United States.
And they didn't let my sister on a boat where we were going to England because they said she was too old, which was not true. She was 14, and they were taking kids as old as 17. But somebody made that decision. Then, together with my mother and father, they murdered her. And I still don't understand how a human being could do what they did. It's just beyond my understanding.
We were put into the home for children to begin with. The bishop of the town and a lawyer, a Gentile lawyer, arranged for children to be put into these homes. And that's how I was placed in a home for girls, and my brother was placed in a home for boys. After a while, that became dangerous also. Private people took us in, a family. It was a mother and her daughter, a widow. They kind of made believe that I was the daughter's child. And my brother was put into a different home in a different village. At first they didn't send me to school, but a very, very short time. But then the other family that was hiding my brother said, go ahead and send her. So I went to a school run by nuns. I was not forced to become Catholic, but I had to learn. But in my heart I was always Jewish, and they didn't baptize me. They understood how I felt. And they were the kindest people. They risked their life, or they were killed. They would be killed if they knew that they hit a Jew.
Where did the captain take you after being denied docking in Cuba?
Headed back towards Europe. He was permitted to dock in Antwerp, Belgium. And as we were traveling back from Cuba to Europe, 4 countries agreed to take some of the passengers: Belgium, Holland, the Netherlands, France, and England. So they divided the passenger list into 4 pieces. My father was an extremely wise man, and he requested to be put on the list for England. And I asked him, why didn't you go to Belgium? After all, we had family there. His answer was, I wanted to be as far away from Germany as possible. Very soon thereafter, Germany started bombing England. Bombs fell nearly every night. We spent many hours, sometimes nights on end, in bomb shelters. Every home had a 6 by 6 foot hole in the ground and a metal covering over it. That would be a shelter only in an extreme emergency where you couldn't get to the community shelter. But you were fully aware that your life was in danger at every moment.
My father was in the coal mines, so I didn't go with him. But my mother wanted to help chop down trees, so I went with her and helped at 5, 6 years old.
What are your most vivid memories of your time in Siberia?
The cold weather, the freezing temperatures. What happened next was Germany invaded Russia. Russia made a deal with the Polish government that Russia would help the Russians fight the Germans. Russians would free all the Polish citizens that are in Siberia. So one day we were told, you're free to go wherever you want. Just about everybody left from the Siberia, which is up in the cold weather, down to the south.
Describe the your journey to Turkestan.
We left Siberia and going down south towards Uzbekistan. The first part, leaving Siberia, was pretty much by foot. Wherever we could, we hopped onto a train. When I say hopped on, I mean hopped on. No, the train stopped, we just ran over, jumped onto the train. It took us a couple of months to get there, from Siberia down to the warm weather. The trip from Siberia to Uzbekistan was a happy trip in a way because we were free. There was no guards watching over us. So we got sort of a normal life, even though the war was going on far away from us. It was a much more normal life.
How did you know the war was over?
The American soldiers liberated the village where I lived. We could see the tanks just ahead of the soldiers, the American soldiers coming, the German tanks were leaving. And it was a very nice sight. I mean, even as I was 11 years old, and I rejoiced with everybody else.
I remember when the war ended and the celebration, I was still convinced that I had no future.
Please describe the day the war ended.
We were very happy. At that time we were hoping that we could go back to where we were and meet our family. We didn't know what we were facing. But as the days went on, more information kept coming in. Our happiness turned into sadness because we were getting prepared to meet nobody. Our apartments were taken over by Polish people, so we wound up leaving Lodz and winding up in Germany in a displaced person camp, a camp called Feldafing. It's a displaced person camp. The DP camp, Feldafing, was a big camp which I would say almost 100% Jewish people. Feldafing was a beautiful Bavarian town, small town. We wound up wearing the youth uniforms. We didn't have our own clothing. I went to a cheder, which was a yeshiva. We learned Chumash and Hebrew.
What memories do you have of the day the war ended?
Exuberance, actually non-belief. I mean, we had lived with this for many years. When we found out that we truly were the victors over the Nazis, made us, I guess, gave us hope.
I'm a child survivor of the Holocaust and of World War II. I was born in 1943 in the very center of Berlin, Germany. 1943 was a dangerous time in Berlin. Over 60,000 Jews were deported from Berlin to concentration and death camps. The first 2 years of my life were thus an endless struggle to survive. On the one hand, there was the threat that my father could be deported by the Nazis at any time. On the other hand, we could always be injured or killed in one of the air raids, which often came twice a day. When I first learned to count as a young child, I counted to 13 because that was the number of steps down into our air raid shelter. Ironically, the very bombing raids that threatened our lives were also our best hope for liberation from the Nazis. And my mother would count aloud as she carried me in her arms so as not to trip in the darkness of the blackouts. With both my parents in forced labor now, their income was so meager that they had to sell some of their few remaining possessions in order to survive. Hunger was pervasive, and we all suffered from malnutrition. For us in Berlin, the end of the war finally came on May 2nd of 1945 with the fall of the city to the Russian army. So at the end of the war, it did not mean our immediate liberation. To the contrary, it only meant that the terror of the Nazis would be replaced by the terror of the Soviet occupiers. The Soviets weren't particularly sympathetic toward the few remaining Jews in Berlin. When they arrived at the Jewish hospital, where my father was in forced labor, my father described them as incredulous at finding Jews alive. One of the officers exclaimed in a broken German, "Keine Juden, alle Juden kaputt," or "There are no Jews, all Jews are dead." Shortly after the end of the war, the Russians summarily executed some of the leaders of the Jewish hospital. Luckily for us, where we lived in the Friedenau section of Berlin, where the lines were drawn, we ended up in the American sector. On July 4th, 1945, the Americans took over control of their sector, and it was our great fortune that we ended up living in the American sector, and finally, the nightmare of the Nazis and the Russians was over for us.
The Shoah was, to a certain degree, a crisis of faith. Our lives are both full of mourning and darkness. It's a period of darkness in Jewish history that is important to be aware of, but painful to relive. And that's the time to focus on emunah, the emunascha balelos. It's a time to examine exactly what was the nature of people's faith in Hashem during and after the Shoah. There were some people who went through the Shoah who lost their faith completely. They said, how could a kind and generous God allow this to happen? Some people lost their faith temporarily and then recovered it a few years later. But the vast majority of Holocaust survivors never lost faith in Hashem, even in the darkest of places. Now, how is that? You would think that people who've gone through this trauma, someone whose parents were murdered, someone who were separated from their families, they lost their siblings, they lost their life, they were on the run, you would think they'd be bitter, miserable people. So why are they so nice? That means they're making it their mission to make something good out of something really bad. We shouldn't define ourselves by what other people do to us. We define ourselves by what we do for the world. They needed you to help them fulfill their mission, which is to spread their message. They're focused on the future, not the past. Hashem created the world with free will. That means every person has the ability to choose good from evil or evil from good. We have to understand that we're not entitled to understand everything. Not everything that happens in this world can we understand why it happened. Unfortunately, if you look at the news, there are tragedies that happen all the time. But emunah requires a certain acceptance that I am not going to understand everything. Life is too precious to dwell on my pain and suffering. Maybe one day we'll look back and we'll see why this had to happen in the world. I suffered a lot in the past, but this is my victory over the Nazis. That's what a lot of them are into. So they look back proudly on the families they built, and that's the best revenge. A life well lived, a life of meaning, a life of giving, and a life of Torah.
This is what we're going to remember for our whole lives. It's not like looking at a book. I'm going to remember his story. I'm going to remember setting the equipment. I'm going to remember everything.
I feel very proud, and I know that I'll always carry this experience with me.
Each story has like its own purpose, and each person who's in the Holocaust has a different approach and perspective about what happened.
Let's say someone comes up to you and say, the Holocaust wasn't real, then you'd be like, yes it is, I'm a Holocaust survivor. I know what their story was and it happened.
Looking at like a textbook or saying like, it feels like so much more like, oh, I'm just learning this because I have to. But when you're there firsthand, like you're like, oh my gosh, this feels so much more real to me now.
It's a little intimidating to be part of the last generation of people interviewing survivors, because that means that like you're the last person to do it, and like feels like there's a little bit more pressure.
It was a great experience, and I got to learn more about the Holocaust and what people went through. It was a very amazing story, and it was very touching.
I thought that I was going to be more nervous than I was, but once I got in there and I met her, she was such a kind lady, and all the things I was nervous about before I interviewed her just went away, and I was just able to ask the questions.
What is your message to our generation?
We are not leaving you the best possible world, and you have the opportunity to make the world better. When you see something that's happening in the world that you're upset about, write a letter. It's amazing. You would be totally amazed how a simple letter to the president, to the rabbi, to anybody can really change things. You can make the world a better place. And you know what? Every time you do something good for somebody, you're doing much better for yourself. You're going to feel fabulous.
I feel very lucky that I got to interview him and get to know him as a person.
This was my first time meeting a survivor. I thought the survivor was going to be like speaking a lot slower and like not as loud, but he ended up being like, he was able to project his voice and we were able to hear him very well, and he was able to speak very like fluently. He was funny, he was very interesting.
The most important thing that we have is that our parents insist on education. Follow your education as far as you can go, and that will give you a pleasant life when you finish the education. And you have opportunities that you can take advantage of.
If we actually hear from someone that survived it, then we know that it's true, and we can hear more facts about it.
The horrors of the Holocaust must be told, because there are too many who deny it happened. It is that hate and bigotry and prejudice, anti-Semitism, and even bullying, if allowed to fester and allowed to grow, might become another Holocaust. It never stops with just the Jews. It only starts with us as a scapegoat.
I feel very grateful that I got to have this experience interviewing her, because I might be the last generation that gets to do this, and a lot of people don't get to do this and they won't have the chance to.
A survivor is someone who's strong and resilient, who's able to make it through whatever comes their way.
It felt so special because that's an opportunity that not everyone gets to have, and not everyone's going to get to have in a couple of years, and it felt so like special to have this opportunity.
Be aware of what can happen. This is not just a history lesson for the sake of history, but unless we learn from it, recognize the signs, look at your surroundings, compare what you see and hear today to what you have heard happened before.
I didn't really know what to expect, so because I've never met a survivor, and it's I'm always going to remember this. It's like a chance of a lifetime.
Now that I've heard his story, I feel really amazed because I never knew that about him. I just saw him as like my great uncle and like a funny person. But now that I know this, it's like really cool to know that he went through all this and that he still has a smile on his face. I think my connection is going to be a lot closer because now like I got to interview him and really know like his personal story. So now like I know what he's gone through.
Marry Jewish, get a great Jewish education, be proud that you're Jewish, and also be proud that you're American.
Baruch Adonai l'chayei amesim. Baruch ato Adonai ha'olam shechayonu v'kimonu v'giyonu lazman hazeh.
I agree.
And now we'll hug him. Unbelievable. My God. Wow. It's an unreal scenario after not seeing somebody for 76 years. That's a long, long time. It was really miraculous to do it. It was very special. Hard to describe in words.
Coming in this morning, I was trying to figure out what I'm going to say when I give him a hug. Turns out that he said something first with me. He had the two blessings in Hebrew, so he gave me the blessings first, and then we exchanged blessings. We hugged each other, and it was a very, very emotional experience.
Thank you for being here to tell us the story.
Thank you for telling the story to us.
You are so strong, and it was amazing what you did and how you got through it.
Thank you for coming, and it was a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you for being here today, telling us your story.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for sharing your story with us, and it was just so special to hear it.